Next, we will turn to Anita Lee from the LAO. Ms. Lee?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Anita Lee with the Legislative Analyst Office. Really appreciate you having us here today. Before we hit the meat of our comments, we thought we'd start by providing a little bit of context of our role here today. So we actually work for you all. We serve as the eyes and ears for the legislature to ensure that legislative policy is being enacted in both an efficient and effective manner. We do that in various ways. One of those ways is through our budget work annually, our analysis, our testimony and hearings, et cetera. But another way is also through either statutorily required or self-initiated topics of legislative interest. And so related to the state bar, in the past 5 years, we've actually conducted 2 statutory required reports on the state bar at the joint request of both committees. The first report was in 2019 and was an examination of the state bar's request for a fee increase in 2020. And then the second report was submitted earlier this year and was an assessment of the state bar's proposed caseload processing standards and staffing requirements for attorney discipline cases processed by the Office of Chief Trial Counsel, or OCTC. And so our comments today really stem from our experiences in completing those 2 reports. So in both of the reports, we indicated that increased legislative oversight could be beneficial to ensure that the fee revenues were provided and used in a manner that was consistent with legislative expectations for state bar operations. And so in line with that, we suggested that the legislature might want to consider what level of oversight it wanted to exercise over state bar processes and funding. And one of those examples that we gave was to consider including the state bar as part of the annual budget process. And so committee staff thought it could be helpful if we spent a little bit of time walking the committees through how that would increase legislative oversight. And so I'm going to spend some of my comments related to that. In bringing the state bar into the annual state budget process, it would actually be treated similarly as many other state licensing departments. So for example, the state bar would still be subject to the oversight and jurisdiction of the judiciary committees. It'd still have the authority to set fee levels, change statute to reflect policy decisions, require reporting, and conduct oversight hearings. It would be very similar to the role that the business and professions committees have over other state licensing departments. And those committees routinely conduct sunset hearings, set fee levels, and engage in other policy-making decisions. But bringing the state bar into the annual budget process means that the legislature is more equipped to evaluate the funding requests, as well as to monitor the use of the funds in a manner that's similar to other state departments. This allows for greater oversight of the technical aspects of the requests, to make sure that there is sufficient justification that's provided, to compare them to kind of the statewide policies and also what other departments are doing, and also to identify areas where particular legislative interests might be merited. So there are really 5 kind of key benefits that we think legislative oversight would be improved. And so I'll walk through those 5. So the first is, since the state bar is not part of the annual budget process, it has flexibility in its budget practices and in the information that it submits to the legislature. So for example, the state bar operates on the calendar system rather than on the state's fiscal year, and the level of documentation and justification and the manner in which it's submitted is actually not the same as any other state departments. And so this can make it challenging to assess the state bar's requests without first spending kind of significant time making sure that all of the parties are effectively speaking the same language, that we're using the same key terms in the same way, that we're aware of how things are documented and calculated, but also then to just how we request the information that we need to assess those proposals. So second, while the policy committees would retain their jurisdiction, the Budget Committee would also be able to examine and monitor whether or not policy decisions were being implemented and funding was used efficiently and effectively to implement those policy decisions. And so of particular concern in recent years, the state bar has been able to make major policy decisions without legislative input or approval. Examples of that include the purchase of the LA building, starting of IT projects, as well as in certain collective bargaining, potentially agreeing to policies that would have longer term fiscal implications. And so the challenge with that is if It would put the legislature in a difficult situation if those costs could not be afforded without a fee increase. So bringing the state bar into the annual budget process really provides the legislature with an opportunity to identify some of those expenditures before they occur, but it also provides an opportunity to actually, for the legislature to prohibit some of those, or to limit or how when they are engaged in. So for example, the legislature can put conditions that need to be met before certain projects move forward. Third, including the state bar in the annual state budget process can help ensure that the state bar's decisions are consistent with statewide policies and that they're treated similarly to other state departments. So for example, in 2019, we found that the salary increases for state bar represented employees were actually consistent with similarly situated state employees. But we also found that the state bar was actually requesting to provide more generous retirement benefits than the state provided to its employees. We also identified for the legislature that the state bar's request to cover 5 years of building and IT costs in a single assessment, as well as a request to adjust the annual renewal fee and the disciplinary fee annually to account for inflation, was actually inconsistent with statewide policies and raised some other concerns. Fourth, inclusion in the annual budget process could require that the state bar provide more thorough justification before changes to operations occur or before decisions are made. Since the state bar is generally able to use their funding based on their priorities without legislative approval, it can result in changes being made rapidly without necessarily thoroughly evaluating the impacts of those changes or justifying them or consulting with the legislature on them. So for example, in 2019, both our office and the California State Auditor's Office found that it would be premature to provide the state bar with a full complement of additional OCTC staff that the state bar was requesting. And this was because various operational changes had just been implemented and the impacts of those changes were unknown. And so subsequently in 2021, the California State Auditor's Office actually identified that one of those recently implemented changes, specifically changing OCTC trial teams from teams that specialized in certain case types to generalist teams that handled all case types, actually significantly reduced case processing efficiency. Fifth, we would also note that the budget framework includes some built-in tools that can be used for ongoing oversight during the year. For example, funding can be limited by provisional language or by line item budget schedules to be used for a particular purpose or to insist on particular conditions being met before the funding can be actually accessed and used. The budget also includes notification requirements for when funding can be shifted to be used for other purposes and lays out the conditions for which those shifts can occur. And so this effectively provides the legislature with more tools to monitor any unexpected costs that are emerging, as well as to ensure that funding is used consistent with legislative expectations and priorities. To the extent the legislature does not include the state bar in the annual state budget process, we note that there are other ways legislative oversight could be increased that achieves some of those benefits that I talked about. And I'm just going to briefly highlight 4 of those in the last few minutes of my comments. So one option is that the legislature could consider changing the existing fee structure to instead approve separate fees for particular purposes, and that would ensure that that funding was used for those legislatively desired purposes. A second option is to specifically require the state bar to seek legislative approval before engaging in certain expenditures. So for example, if before beginning an IT project that potentially has costs that exceed a certain threshold, or other policies that would have longer-term fiscal implications. A third option is for the legislature to incorporate employee compensation guidelines that must be followed in order to inform state bar collective bargaining. And then the fourth and final option is for comprehensive and thorough performance and outcome measures to enable legislative monitoring of how funding was used, but also to help evaluate whether legislative expectations were met, whether additional policy changes are needed, and what future funding levels would be appropriate. So we'll conclude our comments there and are happy to answer questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. We'll take all the questions at the end.